believes private schools should be abolished. Now, many would argue that Britain's education system perpetuates inequality. Look at the numbers. 7% of our children go to private schools, and yet these institutions receive around 3 times the funding per student as the average state school. Privately educated people dominate our elite institutions too, making up 65% of senior judges and 29% of members of parliament. But that is not the whole story. Fee-paying schools don't merely cater for the privileged few, but also for hard-working, aspirational parents who want the very best for their children. Parents who at times go without almost everything else to scrape together the money for a private education. Private schools, it can also be argued, are an essential safety valve for an increasingly stretched and underfunded state school system, and they allow for a quality that is surely essential in all aspects of bringing up children: choice. Is this two-tier system an archaic injustice that needs reform, or is it the route to a better education for all? Let's consider. Let me just talk you through how this evening is going to be structured before I introduce our wonderful speakers for you. So each speaker is going to have 5 minutes each to set out their opening case, and we're going to alternate between the sides, those who are for the motion and those against. Then I will come to you, the audience, for your questions. Think question time, and I will try to channel my inner Fiona Bruce, and then we will vote. We are exceptionally lucky to have 6 wonderful speakers with us. Let me introduce each of them to you. Speaking in favour of the motion are Professor Danny Dorling, Terri White and Professor Aaron Reeves. Danny is a social scientist whose books include Inequality and the 1%, All That Is Solid and 7 Children. He is a Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at the University of Oxford and a patron of Road East, Comprehensive Future and Healy City Farm. In his spare time, this is the best thing I've ever seen in a bio, he makes sandcastles. Terri White is an investigative journalist, presenter and author of Coming Undone. Previously, she was editor-in-chief of Empire magazine and Time Out New York, but Terri now specialises in culture and social affairs with specific focus on class, child poverty and protection, and violence against women and girls. She writes for many publications, including the Sunday Times, The Guardian, Prospect and Grazia, and made the ARIA Gold-winning BBC podcast series on school absence. Terri White, Finding Britain's Ghost Children. Aaron is a Professor of Sociology in the Department of Sociology at LSE, where he works on the political economy of health and social stratification. His latest book, Born to Rule, The Making and Remaking of the British Elite, was published by Harvard University Press. Going up against them and challenging the motion are Professor Mona Siddiqui, Julie Robinson and Baroness Sally Morgan. Mona is Assistant Principal for Religion and Society at the University of Edinburgh. She is known internationally as a public intellectual, and you have probably heard her as a regular contributor to BBC Radio 4's Thought for the Day and The Moral Maze. She is Vice President International of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, as well as a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Julie Robinson was a teacher and head in Sussex prep schools before working for the Prep Schools Association. She joined the Independent Schools Council in 2015, where she's now Chief Executive Officer. The ISC represents independent education at a national level, in the media and across government departments, and Julie has regularly promoted the sector on Sky, the BBC and Channel 4 News. And last but not least, Sally Morgan is Master of Fitzwilliam College here in Cambridge. A former teacher, she became a Labour peer in 2001 and was Director of Government Relations at Number 10 Downing Street from 1997 to 2005. And during that time, she was also Minister for Women and Equalities. Sally is a former chair of Ofsted and Vice Chair at King's College London. Since 2005, she's been chair or advisor to multiple charities serving disadvantaged young people, and she's currently a trustee of the Education Policy Institute and particularly interested in widening access to Cambridge University. Let's give her a round of applause. Speakers were educated, and I'm actually intrigued to know how you were educated too. So, first of all, our 6 speakers, a show of hands please. I'm going to give you 3 options: state educated, grammar, presumably non-fee paying, and private. So, who was state educated? 5 out of 6, okay. Grammar school? Okay. Yeah, okay, yeah. And so no private school alumni here. Okay, just in the audience, state school educated? Oh, fair amount. Grammar school, the old style? Fair amount. And privately educated? Ooh. Well, I've got no idea. That seemed like people voted 3 times. So, nice mix. So, before our speakers try their very best to persuade you, let's take the temperature of the room at the beginning. So if you had to vote now, where do you stand? You should have received a very comprehensive briefing about this snazzy app called Slido. If no one has a phone, I will ask you subsequently, you can raise your hand so you're not excluded. But if you go to your app now, please cast your vote. Would you vote yes, the House, well, you want the private schools to be abolished, or no, you do not? Vote now. Okay. 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to call it. Now, where have we seen that percentage before? 52%, 48%? No. 52% in favour, 48% against. Just, did anyone not get a chance to vote and would like to? Okay, so, quite a few. Okay, so, those in favour of the motion, can you put your hands up? Oh, crikey. No. How are you going to do this?
Yeah, just do those against.
Okay. I don't think I'm going to get a very scientific readout here. Okay, noes? Okay, the ayes have it, but I don't really know by what. So let's stick with our 42-48, just because that's such a cohesive division. Right. Those in favour of the motion are going to kick things off. I'm going to be very strict with the timings. They each have 5 minutes. So, Terri, if you would like to make your case to the audience, please.
Chair, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to open today's debate and propose this House believes private schools should be abolished. Now, I'd like to begin with a quote from a great thinker. And I'm sure the Union has heard from this person before. No, not Angie Bennett, who does say great things about private education and why it should be abolished. Or George Orwell, Michael Gove, who in 2017 described it as a prestige service that secures children a permanent positional edge in society. And that's something I defy anyone opposing this motion or in this room to disprove. Shall we look at the attainment gap between private and state-educated kids? The wildly disproportionate numbers attending any of our top universities, including Ofsted and this very prestigious institution today. But as philosopher Gove points out, a private education is about far more than just a banging education. It's about being gifted a VIP path to an elite life. a fully paid-up ride on the pipeline to power. The very one that results in 2/3 of judges, over half of senior journalists, that's a journalist speaking, and the overwhelming majority of our prime ministers, all hailing from just the 7% of the population that attends private schools. Their admittance based on a sperm and an egg. This isn't, sperm and an egg meeting in a particularly wealthy postcode. How does that not strike us as completely and utterly wild? And I'm sure we'll hear, probably from my opposing speakers, that it's a right in a free market economy. It's a human right even. There will be a sense of entitlement, but entitlement is not a right. And your sense of entitlement does not trump the wider thoughts and concerns and good of society. We live in a country right now riven with inequality, one that is played out day in, day out in our state schools. There are now more food banks in schools than there are in the community. 2/3 of teachers have paid for food for a child out of their own pocket. And there are 3 times the number of total private school kids absent in our state schools. This doesn't have the coverage, by the way, from our media that I am part of, than, for example, the VAT changes to private school education has. And we do live in this country right now, and it is full of inequality and basic unfairness. So how can we justify a system that entrenches that even further? And while any moves, including the frankly half-assed move, half-assed move by Labour on VAT is decried as it's a class war, it's cruel, it's sinister. The only class war in this country with 4.5 million kids in poverty, with 109 of them pushed in every day by the 2-child limit, which, by the way, was introduced so we can control the working class woman's bodily autonomy, is on the call. Let's not get this mistaken. But it doesn't have to be this way. Nationalisation of our education, I think that's a much nicer word than abolition. Nationalisation of our education system, as in Finland, which is now, and has been since, considered one of the best education systems in the world, would lead to more equality, a less socially segregated, empathy-barren society. Because those kids going in doesn't mean it has to get worse. This is the myth. It's the myth that public services have to be broken and inferior. Spoiler, they're made that way by human beings and by human interference. There'll be no incentive to fix education like everyone, including those holding the most power, using the same system. The delightfully pushy private school mums that I'm mates with, don't tell me wrong, putting their shoulders to the wheel alongside us, that is what is right. That is what is fair. And otherwise, you're saying that the majority of kids who suffer in a resource-starved, crumbling state education system, they should be left to save the educational advantage of a few.
That's it.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, in today's debate, we're going to hear a lot about private schools, and you might already have an idea of what they are, what they represent, and who they serve. Those in your mental image include a bell tower, perhaps acres of manicured playing fields, and maybe it looks something like Hogwarts. If so, I'm afraid you have been deceived. A very small number of schools might even look that way, and they end up on the front pages of our newspapers. But the stereotype is far, far from the norm. The private sector includes specialist special needs schools, Montessori schools, bilingual schools, faith schools, schools where the fees are £75 per week. That is the reality. They're full of families who wear normal clothes and drive normal cars and worry about family finances. Over half the country's independent schools have under 150 pupils. Typically, they have primary-aged children. They're co-educational day schools, might be based in a converted house in a big city, might not have any fields. 100,000 of the pupils, 1 in 5, have special needs. In reality, abolishing those schools would not rebalance society towards the least advantaged. The opposite is true. It would harm education overall. I'm a governor at a state school in North London, a brilliant academy in an area of disadvantage, and it inspires everyone to be their best. The pupils at this school benefit from independent schooling. Extra qualifications, which the state doesn't provide, come from free online resources from independent schools. Supporting university applications, there's access to a summer school at an independent school. Gifted musicians partner with 2 local independent schools with music specialism, and teacher training is enhanced by links with independent schools. The principal of this academy is clear with his students. We all raise the bar together, and he would urge you not to abolish or even nationalise independent schools. The situation is not unique. There's a network of 10,000 partnerships, big and small. A typical independent school partners with, on average, 11 different state schools, supporting an average of 400 state school pupils at each one. You will not spread educational benefit by abolishing these good things. We need to encourage more schools to get involved. And on the money, for all the recent talk of independent schools being made to pay tax, we've been supporting the Exchequer all along, paying more than £5 billion in tax each year and the employment of more than 328,000 people, which is more than Asda, Sainsbury's and Co-op combined. And the additional £4.4 billion we save the taxpayer by educating pupils in the independent sector would be lost. In fact, worse than lost, because that cost would now be borne by the taxpayers because the state school system would gain 500,000 new pupils. That £4.4 billion could pay for 138,000 new teachers. Today's motion assumes an attack on privilege, but you would actually undermine educational opportunity broadly because independent schools are mainly small, very diverse. Working families choose them because there isn't otherwise what they need in the local state system. If you abolish that, the extra capacity and specialism that plugs state schooling gaps would be lost. Abolition means the least advantaged pupils get less support from partnerships, fewer places in good schools, and the government has less money for the school's budget. In UK independent schools, you can find children from wealthy backgrounds and child refugees from Afghanistan and Ukraine, looked after children in social care, and talented children on scholarships. More children should have those life-enhancing educational opportunities. A third of independent school pupils already have reduced fees, and £1 billion a year is spent on bursaries. We need to grow that. But abolition means 2 steps back from spreading opportunity and enhancing social mobility. The school fees parents currently pay would not go into funding state schools. That money is spent on a house.
Okay, come, stop.
North London, in the 5th richest city in the world, have a quiet area? Why? My eloquent opposer mentions what's going on in North London and the state school there. But why do we have the economically most divided city in this continent? What is it about this country that has meant that we have developed in this way to think it is okay to have a third, heading towards 40% of children living in poverty, and have a few having access to far more wealth than is found anywhere on this continent, and far more spent on their so-called education? Terry's been kindly passing me statistics from the rest of her speech. The proportion of children who are paid for entirely free on the bursary in private schools, of those going to private schools, is 1.37%. That was in the Sunday Times article.
That's 100% bursary only.
1.37%. Private schools are full of people who think they wear normal clothes and drive normal cars. What are you voting for? In 1997, Tony Blair, his government, hardly that radical, abolished assisted places. The only reason we still have a private sector in this country is that governments have actually been paying the fees at our time of greatest equality. They would have folded without government assistance before then. The only reason he could abolish assisted places is we become so unequal, with the top 10% taking 40% of all income, that there is a strata of people in the United Kingdom who can afford these fees. That strata doesn't exist in any other European country, none of which have anything like this. This form of segregation of our children is unheard of on the continent. You have to go to Chile to find the most similar country where so much is spent on so few. You're right, there are not that many pupils in these schools. But there are an enormous number of teachers and teaching assistants and other people, and an enormous amount of space. And playing fields, and classrooms, not with many children in them. It's incredibly inefficient. At a time when we have 200 small rooms, still too dangerous for children to go under those rooms, and we have enough school buildings in this country for all children to be well educated, we just incredibly unfairly share out our teachers, our teaching assistants, and the space. Sama, hardly radical, like Blair, has introduced VAT. There is a path we are on to slowly becoming a little bit more normal. What you are voting for here is the nationalisation. It may not come for another 20 years, but it's the way we are slowly heading. And why? Because none of these children chose to be segregated. Their parents have chosen to exclude them from the rest of society. Their parents have chosen, out of fear, I understand this, out of fear of going to the local comprehensive, to pay for them to not meet, not socially meet, not know the country that they're growing up in. They might meet these people with them when they go to university, which of course they're incredibly likely to do. It's quite hard not to go to university if you go to a private school. And they might go to guys or brownies, but they're not meeting normal people. You're actually doing this. You're voting for the nationalisation of private schools for the benefit of the segregated, who don't learn amazing things. Yes, they get A's and A stars, and they don't have to do a 9-point question, and they behave like well-behaved dogs at clubs. I would not wish this on any of my children. I would not wish it. And I have spent my life with children who went to private schools, because I've only worked in elite universities, and going. I do talks mostly in private schools, and I would not wish this on any of my children, because you do not know the society you're growing up in. I will sum up with the most famous speech in the world about why we shouldn't have segregation of our children, which is kind, because I think I'm about to run out of money, but at the time, before you slip, former Chief Inspector of Schools Michael Wishall said on partnership.
And you're out of time.
should know because I was his chair, but I can't remember, so sorry about that. This recent debate on private schools, specifically over that exemption, has been characterised as class warfare by the Daily Telegraph. It's been filled with very dramatic rhetoric, most of us being my personal favourite, but the issues at stake of choice, inequality and young people's futures deserve more thoughtful consideration. Today I'm here to argue against the banning of private schools, but please don't misunderstand me. I am deeply opposed to ingrained inequalities in our society. Our country has far too much inequality. The richest 10% hold nearly 50% of all wealth, the poorest 50% own just 9%. Indeed, this city, I think this city, not London actually, has been named by the Centre for Cities as the most unequal city in the UK. It's a shocking and uncomfortable fact that these inequalities mean that healthy life expectancy varies by more than 10 years, depending on where you're born in Cambridge. Inequality is an urgent and pressing issue. Private schooling, though, is not the cause of this inequality, it's a symptom. If only solving our social divide were as simple as abolishing private education, it would be pretty straightforward. So why not abolish? Firstly, frankly, if we start with the abolition of non-state schools, why not non-state social care, childcare, health? I'm not in favour instinctively of taking away choice, but do demand stronger regulation and oversight of private provision. Secondly, nationalising private schools, frankly, would be hugely expensive and politically all-consuming. It's all the government will do. So I'm arguing for a different approach. Reform, improve state provision, and take action to limit the inequity in post-school opportunities that result from private schooling. I do regret that part of the sector has recently operated a sort of arms race, not around teaching policy, but on facilities, theatres, labs, sport complexes, trips. Day school fees are now 75% higher in real terms than at the turn of the century. The cohort, therefore, affording that sort of school has grown smaller, wealthier and more international. The evidence of privilege is clear. Children from families in the top 10% income are 10 times more likely to be in private schools. Privately educated people still dominate influential positions. However, I am delighted the current cabinet shows that this is not inevitable. So if not a ban, I'd like to do three things. One, assess potential without privilege. Two, get meaningful benefit from private schools with charitable status. And three, significantly and consistently improve state education. Firstly, assessing potential without privilege. Applications for university and employment should be made without reference to school, a practice increasingly adopted by forward-thinking organisations. I am fascinated when I still meet people who complain about unfairnesses, rather giving them away. We can go further, and data can be used to identify potential and achievement relative to opportunity, not privilege. Some universities have made real progress. At Cambridge, we've worked really hard to assess potential in context, looking at each applicant's relative performance. This is working. Private school admissions have fallen significantly. My own college, for example, now taking 86% of domestic students from state schools. I know that's just a start. I also know ticking boxes can be clear. We must recognise complexities where we can. Students on full bursaries at independent schools, state sixth form pupils who've had years of private schooling, heavily tutored students, or those at oversubscribed state schools with inflated local house prices. Our approach to education equality has to be sophisticated. Secondly, we must hold properly to account 50% of independent schools with charitable status. Some schools do really impressive work, and I know great heads who've been committed over the years and have often moved between the sectors. It can be a win-win. But many schools fall short. Offering scholarships to attract star athletes or discounting fees for teachers' children is not genuine public benefit. And we know that most 50% of bursaries are not being tested at all. I remember when I was chair of Ofsted, hearing went to school sharing its sports facilities, but on a Monday morning. How is that public benefit? Thirdly, we must significantly and consistently improve state education. We've seen through London Challenge how that can be done. Sustained, absolute focus on improvement, bringing great graduates into teaching, very strong leaders, creating remarkable improvement and achievement. The percentage of London 18-year-olds now going to HE far outstrips other regions. So it can be done. I don't pretend it's easy, nor that the experience even now is equal across all London schools, of course. But I do know that we've got evidence worth building on. So in summary, the path isn't abolition or the status quo, but it's transparency and it's reform. It's a tougher path, but it's worth it.
ladies and gentlemen, looking at Britain over the last 150 years, you could be forgiven for believing that we are slowly, if haltingly, becoming a place where you can go as far as your talents will take you. But this is not true. The existence of financially exclusive schools is simply incompatible with a society that takes seriously trying to achieve anything approximating equality of opportunity. Now, it's important to be clear about something. The power and influence of these schools has declined somewhat over the last 150 years, particularly if you look at the very top of British society. At the end of the 19th century, the alumni of the 9 most prestigious schools in the country, places like Eton and Harrow, ones we know well, comprised about 1/4 of Britain's elite, and this has come down. Among the contemporary elite, the alumni of these schools now make up around 8 to 9% in these top positions, and the same trend is true of independent schools more broadly. This decline needs to be put in perspective, however. 8 to 9% of the elite may not sound like a lot, but the alumni of these 9 schools are 52 times more likely to end up in these positions than those that go to any other type of school. The stranglehold of these schools on positions of power makes a mockery of the idea that access to elite positions is meritocratically achieved. And if we accept that these inequalities in who runs the country is unfair, then the question immediately becomes, what do we do about these financially exclusive schools? And if we look back at recent history, the answer is apparently not that much. But that is unsurprising, when so many who decide the fate of these educational institutions are people who either went to them or paid for their children to go there. Yes, there have been reforms to the educational system that have attempted to weaken the power of these schools. We now have standardised tests. We've removed the most egregiously unfair aspects of the entrance exams at elite universities, and we're no longer living in a world where a quiet word from a well-connected head teacher can get you admitted to Ofsted and Cambridge. But these reforms rarely address these financially exclusive schools directly. And when these reforms have happened, these fee-paying schools have adapted. They've remade themselves into hothouses for the acquisition of educational credentials. We spent most of the 20th century hoping that if we gave everyone the chance to go to school and university, that we could weaken the channels of elite recruitment, that we could break the relationship between privilege and opportunity. But it hasn't worked. The propulsive power of these financially exclusive schools is not in terminal decline. In fact, there's been very little change in the last 20 years in access to top jobs. And so we might ask, if earlier reforms have worked, couldn't we just push for more of the same? Indeed, we've heard a bit of that just now. The reality is that we cannot keep pulling those levers because they're not the kind of levers that you can pull more than once. Further standardising tests won't do much, and admission practices at elite universities are fairly sensitive to some of these issues, though there are people doing great work in this area to do more. And yet, even if we did pull those levers again, the impact would be muted. One reason that piecemeal reform will barely make a difference is because of the self-reinforcing power of these types of exclusive schools. The schools cash in on their status as inequality-generating institutions, and parents understandably have a fairly immovable willingness to pay for those advantages for their kids. The second reason piecemeal reform is unlikely to work is that income and wealth facilitates adaptability. The historian Eve Worth and I have documented how over the course of the 20th century it was the wealthiest schools with the highest incomes that were able to survive and maintain their influence despite educational reforms. The third reason we might expect further reform to have a muted effect is because the symbolic place of private schools in our culture has changed. These kinds of schools are surrounded by a particular kind of silence that obscures their continued importance. Certainly the signalling power of the old school tie has evaporated. But one consequence of this shift is that people are now far more circumspect about how they discuss their education. For our book, Born to Rule, we interviewed someone who hid their private schooling from their colleagues. This active obfuscation masks the persistent power of these schools. The history of private schools in this country provides a sobering corrective to the hope that we can achieve equality of opportunity in a two-tiered system. Big changes to schooling have only had a modest impact, and so if we're serious about achieving equality of opportunity, then we need to recognise that the existence of private schools will only make it harder to achieve that goal.
Ladies and gentlemen, education from primary to higher education has been caught up in one of the most divisive cultural battles today. We all share a worthy ambition to have a fairer society, but the constant critique of private schools is low-hanging fruit. A political football, as if their mere abolition would make us more equal, more happy, even morally better human beings. There's no evidence to show any of this to happen. No reasonable person denies that we have inequality in society. But inequality exists for all kinds of reasons. There are privileges and disadvantages, implicit and explicit, in who we are, our backgrounds, the colour of our skin, our gender, how we look, where we work, and who we socialise with. Inequality manifests itself in multiple ways, and nor does it start or stop at school. To blame private schools as being the main factor behind some of the greatest inequalities in society doesn't really hold up. Redistribution of wealth and resources isn't simply about where we are educated, and focusing on private schools without considering other factors silences this complex debate of fairness. At the heart of this debate is education, which is always lost in the frequent slurs of posh parents, elitism, abnormal clothes, or privilege. It's young people's education which will be impacted negatively if you vote to abolish private schools. And why stop only at private schools? If the answer lies in flattening the space of education, then let's do away with grammar schools that receive virtually no criticism, faith schools and schools which help young people with learning difficulties or other disabilities. Most parents will simply move to the catchment area near to high-achieving schools, making them inaccessible to the masses. House prices in these areas will skyrocket, rendering them unaffordable for those with lower incomes. The disconnect between social classes will grow, and top-achieving state schools will become the new private schools. And where does abolition stop? Should we do away with all distinctions and differences in society, food, clothing, lifestyles? A liberal democracy doesn't demand complete equality. It demands that everyone has access to basic goods for a flourishing life, and where people have freedom to live their lives. We're having this debate in Cambridge, a city constantly associated with its most prestigious university. Selection and distinction are not only central features of education, but all aspects of society: sports, music, drama. If we simply do away with competition and choice in all levels of life, is there any evidence to say that we will become a fairer society? Not at all, because the level of competition drives personal growth and achievement. The debate shouldn't be about income and privilege. It's about why we don't value the state sector enough. I believe strongly in the moral and transformative value of a good education. But we should be levelling up the state sector rather than levelling down all the various kinds of schools which fall under the umbrella of private. Why don't we invest more into our schools, pay our teachers enough so that they stay in the system and are valued? If abolishing private schools includes state schools, I would applaud it. But again, there's no evidence of this. Ultimately, there's nothing to stop parents taking their children's education into their own hands, regardless of the options available. Let's be aspirational but also pragmatic with how we address social inequality. Some of our private schools are the envy of the world and attract pupils and investment and wealth from all over the world. Let's not caricaturize all private schools because some of the wealthiest and most famous schools have churned out inept or dubious prime ministers and politicians. Let's demand that they give more back to the community, increase the numbers of bursaries for children from low income or disadvantaged backgrounds, further share resources and opportunities, nurture talents and excellence for all, create a society where the young feel empathy for one another across the social divide. Let's not demonise the private sector because it's easy, but rather improve the state sector because that's what will transform everyone's lives.
So let's dive straight in. Please raise your hand. We've got some roving mics if you would like to put a question to the panel. Okay, we'll start gentleman with the glasses, please.
Well, thank you very much for an excellent debate. The last speaker mentioned house prices, and I'd like to ask both sides, how do we prevent wealthy parents from using house prices and buying an appreciating asset instead of fees and post-tax income for schools that are formerly independent but would now be in the state sector?
Who wants to take it from this side? Danny?
Okay. While we have an education system so divided with private schools, other parents will flock to catchment areas of good schools. While we have this current system of apartheid of private schools with these very, very high A-level results, other parents who can't afford to go private will flock around particular schools, and so we get this division between neighbourhoods that you see nowhere else in Europe. Right? There is an alternative. It is seen in country after country. They are not all perfect, but people are not paying a fortune out of fear of their children going to school with others. So the problem isn't just private schools. The problem is it's a huge inequality in the state sector, led by house prices, but that's maintained by the tip of the iceberg, which is just a private school elitism. You cannot maintain the private schools and hope to create the kind of level playing field in state schools seen elsewhere in Europe.
But what about this one? Because as Holmes just pointed out, if you get rid of the private schools, then the same thing just happens as Bishop.
If I can just reply on the house prices point. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. You said, well, how can we do it? We can't, is the answer. We can't do that. And my understanding, certainly from recent Southern Trust stuff I've read, is that actually the disparities, the gaps between state schools are more dramatic than between private schools and other schools. And there is just a reality in this, which is that parents will seek how to support their children in different ways. And all we can do, actually, at the end, in my view, is consistently tackle inequality in a much broader way and really invest in our state school system.
Okay, next question, please. Yeah, lady here with on the front row.
I would like to ask Danny, can you tell us why, give us an example of how it works better in Europe, why education is less divisive in Europe and less class-based? Could you tell us more?
It's different in every country in Europe. There are divides. There are the elite schools in France, where they have what they call private schools that the government actually controls what their schools do. The epitome always given is Finland, where in Finland the state schools are all so good that you do not worry about what state school your child goes to. They walk to the nearest one, so they can go to school with their friends who live on their street. Similar things happen across the majority of the continent. We are utterly bizarre, and the fact we can even imagine that something else isn't possible shows how little we know of the continent we live in. There have been times when there were enormous changes. I'm very fortunate to have grown up just past the 11 plus being abolished in my county. When the 11 plus was abolished in Oxfordshire, nobody quite knew what to do. Which is the good school and which is the bad school? In Oxford, the bottom end secondary modern was a school that only had one famous alum called Yasmin Le Bon, Simon's girlfriend. That bottom end secondary modern is now the Tatler magazine recommended state school in my city of Oxford. It took 20 years to flip, and tragically we published school league tables which then accelerated the difference. But that circular that abolished the grammar schools led to a period for a brief time when you walked to the nearest comprehensive and went to school with the people who lived around you. The house price gaps were minimal then between areas. They still existed, a few £1,000s. Now we have a £100,000 gap between the catchment area of every of the 6 secondary schools in my city, the state ones, and a third of children in Oxford, and we don't have many, We have about 970 in the school year. A third of children are going to a huge plethora of private schools, far more than the state schools. Most of those children going to private schools in Oxford have failed to get into the ones that require examination, so they're paying to go to secondary moderns. It's utterly ridiculous, and it's tragic to live in a small city in which the children do not get to meet each other.
Okay, no, I mean, please obviously say what you want, but Danny's mentioned a few times about how we're so awful compared to the rest of Europe. Is he right? And is this sort of rose-tinted glasses going on here about abolition of the grammar schools?
I do think that it's very easy to use the Scandinavian countries. It's, again, a caricature that they have reinvented their education system. They haven't done it in isolation. I lived in Finland, and they have free childcare. They have better paid teachers. The whole system is different. What you're arguing for is let's just do away with private schools and everything will become better. It doesn't. And your own point about house prices, Sally, just reflects that. How do you stop people wanting what's best for their child? How do you stop people wanting to spend where they want to spend their money? How do you stop... Well, I think what we should do is stop characterising that everything private is posh. That's just simply not true. And I think if we stop doing that, we might have a fairer debate about why certain inequalities, we haven't mentioned the word class here, why certain inequalities are endemic to the British system. How do you remove people's desire to be in certain classes?
And then we'll go to the lady.
My question, please, is for Professor Dorling. Can you name 3 countries in the world, please, that ban private education?
I could have a go. I did offer, when I was asked to take part in this debate, to speak to either side. Which may surprise you. I'm obviously at home on this side. The reason I offered to speak to the other side is that the killer question is freedom. And that it's only North Korea and the other 2 I don't know about. Like even Finland has a tiny number of private schools, less than 1%, and they're very subsidised by the state, and they're the ones in which you speak English in and so on. Right? So there are private schools everywhere, but they are incredibly rare. Take, instead of the Scandinavian countries, take Bonn. Bonn is the twin city of Oxford. I asked teachers in Bonn to rank their schools. They find it rather difficult, because these schools are all fairly good. There is a Beethoven Academy state, where the children of Conservative politicians are slightly more likely to go, but it took half an hour and 2 bottles of wine to get that out of a teacher, right? Ranking. And then I said, what about the private schools in Bonn? I said, oh, there is one, for somewhat slower boys. Your Prince Philip went there. Imagine. So, yes, you want to allow there to still be everywhere in the world, apart from those dictatorial states, allows a bit of freedom. Because you never know, it's a litmus test, it tells you if things are going wrong in your state system. But you're talking, you want to be in a situation where 99% of parents are happy with the brilliant education they're getting in their new school, and it's brilliant, because it's properly funded, unlike the huge cuts we've had in state education, because the parents with power care because their children are going there too.
Sorry, I wonder, do you have anything just to get this
I rankled, I know we're like on the second side, this notion of freedom. Freedom, if you have wealth, let's be clear about that. Freedom is not granted equally to everybody in this country. I mean, never mind it being this neoliberal kind of idealism about the benefit of the individual over society. I believe we have a responsibility as a member of a society. When something has been proven, we can talk data all day long about the huge gap between state school kids and private school kids, and we talk about, oh, it's just education, private schools alone wouldn't fix this, is systemic. Of course it's systemic, it's generational, because they leave that school and they get into a university. Do you think most working class kids can even go to a university these days? They're then much more likely to move away from home, and there's a really good book called Underdogs, The Truth About the White Working Class, that's just been published. And basically at the moment, the social mobility of the white working class has stopped completely. One of the reasons is education, one of the reasons is they physically just can't afford to leave their And the reality is that impacts where you live, the property you buy, the money you make off that property, how your kids are then educated, the money they make. This is how it is about much more than education. It is about your life. And, you know, we talk about the demonisation of people in private school, but that isn't what that's about. It's about recognising that it's privilege, and that is a privilege and freedom. We live in a society where 2/3 of our public support the 2-child limit, which essentially tells working class women how many children they may have.
I think we're slightly off topic.
My point is, freedom in this country is absolutely bound up in the wealth that you have as an individual, and to pretend that it's just freedom we're talking about outside of the context of wealth is absurd.
Okay, welcome back.
But I think, for what you just said, you're actually proving what we're saying. It's not just about private schools. It's systemic in how do you go to every layer of society, every aspect of society, and say, we're going to take away competition, we're going to flatten this space so everybody's equal chances. Even if you were to give people equal chances, not everybody would take it. People have, it doesn't matter which class or how wealthy you are, people have the right. No, I completely agree that if you have wealth, you have more options. But that's not just about education. And how do you stop the really wealthy from just going around the system, cutting through the system? Because people who want what's right for their children, whether they're right or wrong, will do anything and everything. You can't stop that. You can't stop it logically, you can't stop it realistically. So unless you change the whole of society and say, no, choice is actually problematic. Freedom is problematic. Every stage we're going to flatten the space. How are you going to get round by just saying, let's abolish private schools and everything will be better?
Did you want to come in on a specific point, or another question? Just because, okay. I said I'd go to that lady first, and then you next. Is there a mic there? This lady there.
Thank you very much. This is a question to both all the panel. Professor Siddiqui, you mentioned levelling down. We're not talking about levelling down. We're talking about bringing children up. I'm a parent and a teacher who worked in the state sector for over 3 decades, and I was educated in the most privileged private school. You can tell by my voice, you can tell by my demeanour, and you can tell by the social capital that I've enjoyed all my life. I am totally in favour of making this society more equal. I am frightened for our children that they are growing up in such an unequal environment, in such an unequal society. The children in Cambridge, a lot of them, I'm going to say busting because the size of their cars is so large that really the people carriers, but it's just one family. So they do not drive normal cars, they do not have normal playgrounds, and they do not walk down the streets and meet normal children. They are segregated.
Can I ask that?
Okay, the question is, Nick Jones, towards the end of last century, suggested that rather than abolish private schools, that you take away, in order for them to earn their charitable status, that they should not be able to select by ability. So I would argue that to keep private schools for special needs children funded by the state, so we keep all those wonderful buildings, we keep all the wonderful playgrounds, etc. I just wanted to hear what your opinion would be on that.
Okay, I think we've had two
very briefly on the public benefit point. I actually agree with you about, I would be much, much, much tougher on charitable status than things are at the moment. And I'm sorry, Julie, I was pretty hacked off when the 2006 the Act was sort of not, it was challenged by the independent sector. I thought that slightly gave the game away. Because I think actually we should be really, really tough. If schools are getting the benefits of charitable status, they've got to be genuinely doing bursaries, not variations on that. They've got to be genuinely helping to get a wider range of students in, and we've got to hold them account for the partnership work that they're developing with state schools. Because we know it can be done, we know the good ones do it, but we also know quite a lot don't.
Julie, come in and then we'll go to the other thing.
Yeah, I really want to say something about charitable status and special needs schools in the independent sector. this government has already removed most of the benefits of charitable status for schools which are run by charities. We've already heard that only half the independent schools in this country are charities. We shouldn't even just keep this at charity schools only. All schools are part of their local community. All schools are aware of their civic duty to their local community. And the schools I am talking to, I spent 35 years in independent schools across the UK. I visit them now. A few weeks ago, I went to a therapeutic school which provides specific special needs tuition, but it's just not possible for the state to put all that money in there at the moment. And I know Terry's worried about the level of bursary support. 1 in 3 children in independent schools have a reduced fee. Means testing has improved over the time. I agree with Danny on this, I agree with Sally on this. All schools should be working together to lift the bar together, but levelling up. Not just a tax on good schools. Let them demonstrate how they are relevant to the rest of society, because they've got good things in them they can share. They've got specialist teachers who don't exist in the state system. Let's get them together.
Okay, Aaron, it's for you.
I'll be really brief. So in my remarks, I focused very explicitly on financially exclusive schools. I think there probably is a case for retaining a small private element of the sector that addresses particular special needs, and I think there are countries around the world, including Finland, which do this, and I think that's really important. But at the moment, the charitable status is really made a mockery of. I mean, you have a situation in which state schools kids are invited to come watch the private schools perform in theatres. You know, I mean, this isn't the kind of charitable work that really is part of being in your community, right? And on top of that, I think the idea that it's true that the numbers that are said about means testing, but it also, that means testing can kick in at salaries over 100 grand a year. I mean, this is also not really reaching down to the bottom, and those bursaries can be for very small amounts. I think the number that Danny cited via Kerry is a really important, like fully funded, it's a very small proportion.
Okay, Terri.
I mean, I watched the debate that was here earlier this year, and it said 2/3 bursaries, I'm sure you correct me if I'm wrong, 2/3 bursaries are means tested, and actually means testing can go up to 6 figures, and there are things like sibling discount and things like that which aren't about reaching the most disadvantaged children. But it ties in kind of with your question about special educational needs. I made a documentary about why our children are absent from school. And the 2 biggest reasons after illness are special educational needs and disabilities being unmet and poverty, right? And those 2 things intersecting are causing a crisis in our schools. I know parents who use private education because it's the only way they can get the help for their children that they need. As a human being, I understand that. I think it's stopping government from really tackling the problem. The scale of this issue is beyond what I think there is capacity to address in the private sector. And so what we still have is kids being educated at home because school isn't safe for them or doesn't have the right provision. There is the mess between local government and between councils and schools. It is a huge crisis in and of itself. But I think the problem with private education is with these exceptions, it allows the kind of rest of people, it allows the 99% to sit there and kind of have to make do with their lot, but it's okay because we help out a small number of these children, a small number of disadvantaged children. That isn't fixing the system, that's creating acceptance to justify your releasism.
Thank you. I think we're so close to Park Street Primary School, the school where my daughter goes to, and I wanted to tell you about 2 families who have a dilemma about private school, and ask for your opinion generally. The 2 families, Labour voters, 2 little girls, very gifted girls, love reading, love math, sent to one of the worst performing secondary school, and they will go there in year 7. One family has the means to send their child to an expensive private school, the Paris in the city, and they will choose to do that. I want them to have the choice, but that family has supported Park Street Primary School so much. They led the PTA, they supported the children, they volunteered, they built the library, they painted the walls, they created the playground. if they were going together with my daughter to that poor performing school, my sense is that we could work together to improve that school, that we could build the library together. I would join up with them. I feel like the only choice that I can see is for public schools, fee-paying schools to be abolished. Then all the parents who want to work together can do that. It doesn't cost a lot of money, but it costs quite a lot of family capital and joining together to do that. And I was wondering why, with this very local example, you still think that abolishing them would be wrong.
Okay. We're going to
real dilemma, isn't it? Really my advice to that family would be, if they can afford the fees, pay the fees for their children to go to the independent school. They are subsidising themselves by doing that also, and become a governor. Because otherwise the state's paying per each year. Become governors of that primary school, support that primary school. And that's what I'd say to everyone in this room today. Be a governor in a school, visit some schools. I really hope you can be part of the system. If you care about this, be a governor and support the school. But you can support a school without necessarily sending your children there. Be a governor.
Okay. What's going in? Aaron?
So, I think the point here, and Danny's already made this, but I think it's absolutely critical to stress, which is that one of the reasons that getting rid of these schools is so important is precisely because we want families to work together to make their schools better.
By forcing them to do that.
But, yeah. Because we want to recognise that we live in a community that has a shared consequence for all of the kids, right? That actually we don't want those energies to be directed only towards their family, right? We want those energies to be used for the betterment of everyone in society. And I think that those energies are really important and valuable, and it's fantastic that parents care about their education, and some people have more resources to devote to their kids and the community that they're involved in. And I think we want to use that and benefit from that as a whole society. And that's the reason why I would say go to the school and make it better.
Yes, right in front of me, standing up in the doorway under eyes.
Hello. My question is for those arguing to keep private schools. And I noticed in your argument, time and time again, you recognise that whether or not the inequality is due to our country as a whole or the private school system, there is inequality. I mean, just as you began the debate, you talked about some fees of private schools being as little as £75, and yet there are people within our country who do not have that money to buy food each week. But that's not my point. My question is for you. If we recognise that private schools give children cultural capital and many other opportunities that give them kind of the upper hand, more chance than state school children, and this contributes to the inequality within society, if not abolishing them, how do you propose to target this inequality and make our society more equal, which I would hope that you would want to do?
I'm
really sympathetic to what you said, but what I was trying to say very clearly is that schools are a symptom of the wider situation in society, and just dealing with schools in a little corner, if you like, doesn't shift the dial in the way that I think many people in this room want to do. So it has to be a much more holistic take. If we're serious about reducing inequality, we have to mean it across the piece. It's a bit of a tick box, although that's easy, that'll make things better. Actually, if you look at a lot of schools around the country, I think when I've only been in Cambridge for 6 years, I was quite shocked when I first came to Cambridge, because actually I think the divisions within the schooling system, between schools and system, are actually bigger than I've seen in other places. I mean, I've spent many, many years in London schools, and the genuine links between the independent schools and the state schools, often arranged in a sort of around a local authority geography, are really powerful and quite demanding on both sides. I've visited schools where they have trained extra teachers that they put all the time into the state school down the road, and they move teachers between. So I think there are lots of ways that we can really change things for people, and I don't accept that social capital is just is just created in a very small group of schools. There is social capital created in lots of schools around the country, but we've all got to commit to doing that properly.
Okay, this gentleman second from the back. Over here, please.
Thank you very much. inequality in society is very systemic, and it's, you can see it's been reflection in our schools. If it's so systemic, the issue that we're addressing here, we're a bunch of middle-aged adults in this room. There's not been much talk about the children themselves. If it is systemic, two things. One, we've got to start somewhere, and two, why don't we start with the next generation? If we're going to change that system...
It's a very relevant question, but I think the issue for me still is, do you really, let's stop characterising, let's take away the middle class, the big cars, the posh clothes. But people are really wealthy. Do you really think that if you had this ideal of a completely equal system, that's where they would send their children? They wouldn't, they would find other means. Just like people with wealth today find other means of giving extra tuition, extra sport, extra music. And the thing is that you may disagree with that, you may think that's immoral, but how do you curtail that side of human emotion? And that sort of generation, I want my kids to do better than I did. It might not be to do with private school, but that feeling and that emotion is still there, and it will release itself in other ways.
Terri? I think it's fairly mad to be kind of posh, not always just posh people. People with money will find a way to circumvent the system anyway. It's not a reason to allow something that I don't believe is just a symptom of inequality, it's a driver of inequality. To that gentleman's point, I love you, pal, you're brilliant, because people call me naive when I say this, and I say, because what would be better for our country right now, for the next generation? Our country is divided in so many ways, and bring an education system together that brings our country together, that brings our children together, that tells our children that it's your character, it's your talent, it's your graft, it's all of the things you possess as a human being, not what is in my purse, that will define your life. That's the system, and that's meritocracy, that's all that is, and we're taught like that's like a mad socialist fantasy. That should be a functioning, healthy society in which we bring up the next generation.
We're going to go man with the red check shirt here, then lady back here, and then this gentleman here, and we'll see how we move time. Not much. Let's see as brief as we can. Everybody, questions, answers.
I think the hand in the middle, in the suit, focuses on freedom. I think this is fundamentally about freedom. If you want to bear with me for a slightly pompous reference, the natural result, natural conclusion of sacrificing freedom for equality in this domain would be such a public that he thought that all children should be taken away from their parents and raised communally and prevent any sort of hint of parents' influencing the outcomes of their children. We naturally recoil at this because we recognise that parents ought to have the freedom to raise their children as they see fit. My question is, those who would abolish private schools, would you abolish homeschooling? Would you abolish tuitions, parents paying for tuition? Would you abolish many parents banding together to pay for one tutor, multiple tutors to school their children together? And so naturally,
yeah, again, it's a good point. It's on this freedom point, and if you, where does it stop if you abolish the private school?
Those who know me know I don't normally wear suits, but I would like to win this debate. So I'm going to sacrifice a day of losing my freedom of dress code. It's a fair point. I mean, this, like I say, it's the killer argument for the other side. The killer argument for saying not abolish is the freedom to do some different things to what the state, even at its best, will do, to give you an idea. And so private schools exist in almost every country in the world. But nowhere else spends a third of all the money they spend on secondary school children on some of the ones who are already doing best at school. It's the most inefficient way to educate a country. One reason why Finland as well, by the way, the Finns came over to watch what we did in the 1960s and copied it. They don't spend equally on children. The Finns spend the most on the 10% of children doing worse at school. The result for their country is unbelievable. But you will always have parents who are scared that in a more equal system, you don't have to subject your child to the tutor at night because you're so afraid. It's a terrible childhood.
We hear things are great, Danny, but to this gentleman's point, where would you draw the line then? Say we abolish the schools, what else would you stop?
No, you begin with the nationalisation of the schools. What you are hoping for and aiming for is that the need then that people feel to do other things, like get the tutors in, diminishes. Tutors are allowed in every other country in the world. You can't stop it for staff. I mean, how would you have Stasi police noticing the tutors? But people do not subject their children to this terrible childhood of sitting there at 14, 15 and 16 years old, trying to work out exactly what trite and stupid answers they have to write down on poetry to get to grade 7 at GCSE English.
Okay.
So we end up with something that isn't even an education.
We're going to have posing on.
I've been teaching for about 10 years now, and I realised that it doesn't sound like it, but I actually went to primary school in Liverpool in the 90s. And I've noticed when I started my career in private education, this is my experience, there's an untold sort of rule that it is a business, and that these children are our quote-unquote customers' children. And it does become almost transactional. And what I've seen is that it is a system that capitalizes on parents' anxieties who want to provide the best for their children. And I guess my question is, if we could at the very least agree on not abolishing private schools, but just understanding that the way that they function needs reform, and that the way that there is a huge difference. I work now in state education. There is a huge difference in the way this has evolved, and it needs to be curbed.
Julie, I think I'm going to pick on you. You're the best to answer that in your role. I mean, Sally's made this point that the current system is not really working, but speaking to this concern, do you think it needs to evolve? We should stop through to this as customer
reform it, work together on it. So increase the access, increase joint funding in some way, increase access to special needs provision. Certainly work together. Make sure all the partnerships are great ones. There are tons of partnerships where an independent school has sponsored the development of a brand new state school and then little independent schools, because I'd like to remind you, I did point out that the majority of independent schools in this country have under 150 pupils. 9 of the 3,000 UK independent schools might have something great, wealth-wise, they might have a foundation, but on the other hand, they haven't got very much. But ensure they do give where they can. So the big schools do a lot, the smaller schools do something.
But listen, I think what this lady's getting at, sorry Julie to interrupt you, but is the relationship between the child, the pupil in the school, rather than society, and
I think if we're going to talk about education, all of education is a business. We've got our universities. They are businesses. They come under government, under business, not education. So I think that relationship has shifted over the years anyway. But I do think that education should be seen as a moral endeavour. Doesn't matter where you get it. It should teach you, it should unsettle you, it should show you that there's another way of being. And I do think that simply saying that abolishing private schools will lead to a better moral endeavour, to more equality, to everyone getting equal life chances, I think that's simply not true. And even societies where the division might not be as stark, it hasn't shown that people's life chances come for a variety of reasons, not just the school they went to.
Okay, one final question. I sent this gentleman here, and then we will vote. Oh, this is quite good.
Oh, me then.
Many of you won't remember it, but in the 1960s there was a very clear feeling that private education was diminishing, the quality of grammar schools was very high, and there was a lot of reason why you would be better to send your children to a state school. That was brought to an end by the disastrous closing of grammar schools and bringing in comprehensive education, which was a catastrophe. I think recently there has been a movement where the state system has been improving in all sorts of areas, especially with academies.
Okay, please, we have to carry on. Let's ask a question.
The question is whether closing public schools, rather than letting them decline in the face of something better, whether that would not simply cause, for one generation, a stage of absolute educational chaos, which would damage them very badly.
Okay, this side, that sounds like one for you. Aaron?
Yeah, sure. I think I remember many years ago as a young kid watching a video about those educational reforms, and wasn't old enough to remember them. And I remember this woman who said, you know, she went to one of the secondary modern schools, and she said, we never got the chance to read Shakespeare, and I would have loved the chance to do so. And that woman has stuck with me ever since. And so to say that the comprehensive schools was a failure, I think is something that I personally think is terrible. I would never have gone to a grammar school as a kid. I didn't get the chance to do those sorts of things because of the family that I went to. And yet I now have the opportunity to be in rooms like this and talk about these kinds of situations. And it's because of a comprehensive education that it made that possible. I think the debate about academies is a very complicated one. And when they started, they seemed to be doing really well. And over time, the evidence has shown more and more that actually they're just the same as any other school. That actually that kind of independence isn't really driving the kind of innovation that we hoped from it. That what really matters is actually just supporting financially state schools.
Okay, so it's going to come back to the
academy programme because I've been involved forever in that. I mean, look, my take on academies, I've got a level of sympathy with you because actually what really, really matters is high standards and high expectations and really focusing on kids and their outcomes and not really looking at anything else and holding people accountable. And my view is you've got to hold people accountable whether they're in the independent sector, whether they're in the state sector, and whichever bit of the state sector they're in. If they're an academy and they're not doing well, we've got to take action. If they're a maintained school and they're not doing well, we've got to take action. So I think, in the end, I am somebody who believes strongly about standards much more than structures, but sometimes structural change can help. But I think the nature of the debate today has shown that actually the whole ecosystem is a lot more complicated. If only it were simple, in a sense, it would have been done.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry. I'm already over. And I know that some of our panel have got to shoot off quite quickly. So Danny is going to make the closing arguments for those in favour of the motion.
I really want to let you in, but I'm going to be really easy. Going to finish that quote I found earlier. Why further reform will not help? On partnerships, former Chief Inspector of Schools, Michael Wishaw, said that those partnerships were no more than crumbs off your table, leading more to famine than feast. Of course, the private businesses, or sometimes called charities, that work on fear, are going to say they're doing something good and helpful for the lower orders. They have to. They can't say we're making money out of the fear of parents, but that is what they're doing. The word abolition is strong because it makes this harder to win, and because things have moved so far in this country, you know this is wrong. So we're using the word abolition to make you really think about it. And I do want you to think about the families who use the private sector, because a large number of them are only able to do so because they're not getting any holidays for their children. Some of them are even going hungry to pay those fees. They're taking the last savings of grandparents because they're so frightened. I could argue about the other 93%ers and why it would be great for us, but there are children going to private schools whose families are impoverished. I've met parents who tell me that everything has gone, but they've gotten the boy through to age 16. It's tragic, and they think he'll be safe. He'll end up at Leeds and Manchester like kids from the state school do. But it's ridiculous. There's going to come a time when we can no longer afford this. We can only afford this because the best of 10% are taking 40% of everything. That's the only reason we can still have this system. And there will come a time when we can't. It happened almost in 2008, the banking crash. A series of private schools nationalised themselves then. They quietly and gently became called academies and they went state. There is a very civilised way of doing this. We've done it before. I just have to end with the last one. The strongest argument ever given for the abolition of these divides was given by a man who was waiting to find out if he was going to be killed. That man quoted a series of statistics about how much money was spent on some children's education as opposed to others. The key figure was 6. One group of children were having 6 times more spent on their education on average than the other children. The speech is called "This is a Truth I'm Prepared to Die For," and the man who used education statistics at the very heart of his speech about the whole problems in the society was called Nelson Mandela. Educational divides are the strongest and most important divides in our society. If we allow our society to keep on dividing as it is, we are heading towards being like the United States of America. Okay. That's why you should vote for abolition.
Any debate that starts with coaching mind to vote is for the beginning. Let me start by saying that this is neither role. There are excellent state schools. There are bad private schools. There are excellent state school teachers. There are bad private school teachers. I would go back to my initial comment that let's not characterize all private schools because it's easy. It's easy to throw the slurs and uses of a partial or western and actually not look at the complexity of this debate. One of the things that we've not said, and I think you're wrong to say this, is that people are paying for private school education by parents or the states. They are deciding what to do with their money. They are deciding whether they want to work hard to send their children. And they are deciding whether they want to make a sacrifice to do this. You can absolutely disagree with them, but it's their choice. And I'm not saying that choice is absolute. I'm not even saying that freedom is absolute. But when it comes to education and that inner desire to want to do something for our children, our grandparents did something for my parents, who were doing something for, I'm going to do something for my children. Where do you draw the line on that? Where do you say to people that this is not going to be good for your children? When I say, actually, I don't want you to tell me, I've already decided this is the right thing for them. The one thing that I've not heard at all, yes, we've been told that private schools drive inequality. I don't see any evidence of that. What we also have been shown is if you abolish private schools, how did equality come about? And that's why I think what we're really looking at as reform of the private school education system, recognition and levelling up of the state school system, and not the simplistic notion, let's abolish private schools.
Thank you very much. Please can you cast your votes now, for or against? You've got 30 seconds, and I'll come to those who have not used it. More seconds.
I hope the eyes are faster. They're getting in there quicker.
I mean, Danny got a whiff at the end.
Okay.
I think you got it across the line.
There, clearly a shift towards those in favour of the motion. For those who have not used the Slido, just for my eyes, would you stand up if you're in favour, please? Okay, please sit down. And if you have not used the Slido and you are against the motion, please would you stand up? Okay, the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Well done. Well done.